every speaker as a co-host today?
Done already.
Okay.
I'll tell you when we are live, Bhargavi, and we can start. Bhargavi, just identify all the speakers or co-hosts. I don't know who they are. They're all
Yeah.
co.
Yeah, Ambika, and you have to make Nandini also.
Is it? Okay, I'll do that. Okay, we are going live on Coast. I'm not going to do any.
And Dhruv also. Dhruv Chakravarti.
Or live. What?
We are ready?
Go ahead. We are ready.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this series on interdisciplinary action research, conversations with emerging leaders, a collaborative initiative of Center for Financial Accountability and Environment Support Group. We've had a couple of sessions earlier. We started with the theme of smart cities, then we discussed about wetlands, and then we discussed about the man-animal conflict issue, especially in elephant territory. And this week, we have another very interesting topic. So before I introduce the topic and hand over the forum to the speakers, a little bit about why we started this series. So as we're all getting used to this COVID amidst us and getting used to the fact that working from home maybe for a longer time, and we are getting used to isolations and quarantines and masks and the whole concept of physical distancing and social distancing. Just about everything around us requires fresh new thinking. And as our economies are crashing and informal communities are constantly trying very hard all around us, given that they form a majority of the economic population, there is a lot of ongoing research, again, all around us, which we need to kind of look into, draw attention to, learn from it, because there's so much happening which will help us rethink this entire situation in rebuilding a post-COVID economy and a post-COVID world. So in that context, we thought it is very important to see areas, especially with urban planning, public health, IT, sociology, ecology, environment, public education, migration studies, entrepreneurship, and a bunch of other areas where people around us have been very quietly working. It'll be interesting to understand what they think of their work, how challenging it has been over the last few years and now, and where do they see it going. It's important to hear the voices of these emerging leaders because they are in the thick of their research and some of the ongoing implementation work. So that was how we started this series of webinars by emerging researchers and leaders. And we hope this again will be another very in-depth conversation which will help understand a whole lot of things happening in the areas where our researchers for today are working. So these webinars are scheduled every Thursday between 5 to 6:30 p.m. and it's open to all by prior registration. And today's topic, as you all know, is about the digital commons. And we have a group of organizations who agreed to come on board and have a conversation about the area of digital commons with us. So before I hand over the forum, like I said, our moderator for today is Ambika Tandon. Thank you, Ambika, for agreeing to be the moderator. And Ambika Tandon is a researcher at the Center for Internet and Society. She works at the intersection on gender and technology. Over the last year, she has been leading a project on domestic work in the platform economy in India. So over to Ambika. And before I hand over the forum, again, some basic rules. We will all keep our microphones on mute, except the speaker. We will keep our cell phones on silent. And any comments, questions, feedback, we would encourage it on the in the chat box so that it's easy for the moderator to take it up. And if there is time, we will permit you to speak. Otherwise, let's go with the flow of the chat box is what I would say. So thank you everyone for joining, and over to Ambika. Thank you, Ambika.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, now you're audible.
Okay. Hi, thanks, Bhargavi, and thanks so much for ESG and CFA to organize these very interesting series. So our agenda for today is to be talking about the digital commons. So we'll talk a bit about what the digital commons are to begin with, what some of the key issues are that impact the discussion around economic rights and inequality in the digital economy with regards to data and the digital commons. And we'll also talk a bit about how they can be leveraged by women's collectives and other on-ground organizations in their work. And finally, we'll talk a bit about possible policy frameworks to govern the digital commons. So our speakers for today are Nandini Chami for IT for Change. And we also have Dhruv Chakravarti and Anupriya from SEWA Bharat and the SEWA Federation. So Nandini, would you want to talk a bit about your work?
Thank you, Ambika. And I want to thank CFA and ESG once again for this opportunity to talk about a very important issue of our times, the digital commons. And I would like to begin this conversation today by placing on the table, why is this issue relevant? Why is it that we should at all be interested in the digital commons? So to begin with, today, I think it's quite indisputable that we are privy to a new economic order. And this is an economic order in which the value generation and the source of value generation has really changed in the economy, and data and digital intelligence have become the main source of value. And the proof of this lies in the statistics. For example, as the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development observed in a report in 2019, in just a mere 10 years between 2009 and 2019, if you look at the list of top companies by market capitalization, you will see that the transnational digital companies are edging out the traditional corporate power giants like oil and gas companies and financial services companies. And what is unique and special about these transnational digital companies is their business model, which has been described by many as a platform model. What is a platform? A platform is essentially an infrastructure that facilitates connections between a range of interlinked economic actors, and then it uses the interactions data that is generated out of the exchanges between these actors to control entire ecosystems. And what we see is that because of the internet and the operations of network effects, first mover platforms have a lot of advantage, and you see the emergence of winner-take-all and monopoly business models across all value chains as the economy becomes increasingly digital. And just to explain this in simple terms, take the case of Amazon. What started out as a company selling books 20 years ago and which made loss after loss year after year for over 2 decades suddenly becomes one of the formidable giants of our time and a key market cap player. And why is that? It's because the 20 years Amazon has used to build a network system and capture that network and the data that is flowing on top of the network to produce unique cloud and intelligence products. So what is the point of this story or this intro? The point is that today, in this 21st century, market power and data power are synonymous, and the economy that matters today is the intelligence economy, where AI and digital intelligence is generated out of data and network data flows. And like in any other age of capitalism, where often like market power, the first move of market power is to enclose the critical value generating resources, in today's age, you actually see that the transnational digital corporations are able to perpetuate their monopoly because they have enclosed data power. Just because they created the initial pipes that allowed data to flow across different users, by sheer first mover advantage, they are enclosing the data commons for perpetuity, right? So they are able to fence in the data and also prevent other people and innovation from ever happening. And it's taken a very long time for people to get their head around this business model. It's only now that people are starting to think, competition law regulators are starting to think that there may be a problem here, and data power has to be seen as a source of antitrust advantage, and things have to be seen. And as usual, the arc of regulation is trying to play catch up, and it shouldn't be too late. And so at this point, we should actually see how do we like reclaim our data resources from big tech so that we can build an economy that is not serving the interests of big tech, but that is serving the development choices that people want. And this is why the digital commons matter, because you cannot take back the power of data unless we have a people-centric network infrastructure, the digital pipes that enable data to flows, and you have some kind of system where there are collective claims that are possible to assert over these data flows. And we are also setting boundaries for what business case models are possible, because today we live in an age of surveillance capitalism where data mining is free for all, and there is no end to personal data mining and rapacious exploitation, and there is nothing about, what are the ethical limits of data mining. And if we need to like challenge this, we need to first establish like the movements of the past, especially friends from ESG would certainly acknowledge that like there was an era where we talked about Jal, Jungle and Jameen and people's claims over that. This is an era where we have to talk about people's claim to data. And this is why the digital commons matter, so that we can change an economic model that serves people and not profit in the current context. And I just want to make like one more small point, like, which will help us move forward in the discussion. Typically, when we talk about the enclosure of data, we are usually confining the discussion to surveillance capitalism and the privacy and personal data protection incursions. This is, of course, a top-level problem, and I'm not denying the importance of the problem, but I'm saying that beyond that layer, it's also important to see how we can reclaim data so that we can build a new type of people-centered economy where the data is used to build businesses and economic models that actually further economic autonomy and self-determination of people at the margins. And here I would like to share a testimonial which is coming out of our research in this area, where this is from an activist who works with the organization Green that has been fighting for the rights of small and marginal farmers for a lot of years. And we know that typically in the Asia Pacific, marginal and small farmers are usually women, and they are in subsistence agriculture models. So she's speaking about how new services models in agriculture that are initiated by platform and data companies actually threaten women's economic autonomy. And I would like to quote her own words because she can put it far more beautifully than I can ever hope to. So I begin by quoting her from Green. Let's take the case of Alibaba that has become synonymous with the new platform business model in agriculture and e-tail. In the initial years, the company's strategy was focused on connecting small-scale farmers in China with upper middle-class consumers, catering to the niche consumer segment, demanding direct farm-to-fork supply of food products. They started an app for facilitating this connection and onboarded farmers by enticing them with bundled credit and retail market linkages. In the early years, they were just the intermediary. But along the way, as over 500 farm-to-fork small agricultural businesses mushroomed in the countryside, they spotted a new business opportunity, that of directly getting into the business of food retail. This end-to-end control of the agriculture supply chain has meant getting into the business of data-based analytics of every segment. With the voluntary labor of unsuspecting small farmers, companies like Alibaba can mine the big data they need using drones, AI, and the rest to eventually robotize farming itself. Alibaba is now acquiring farms in other countries where prices are lower and yields are higher than in China, building a cross-border supply chain for different agricultural commodities. In the case of dairy, this has already happened. Alibaba's farms in New Zealand, from where milk is imported, have led to a complete squeeze on Chinese milk producers. In this new system, those engaged in subsistence farming will be completely edged out, as there will be no room for small-scale local production. So the point is, how do you reclaim a data economy for the edges, for inclusive innovation? And I think this is why we need to talk about the digital commons. And when we talk about this, we are actually asking critical questions such as this. How do you design a platform cooperative for domestic workers where the behavioral profiling is not geared to meet the client's casteist or racial biases, but actually geared at transparency and accountability for the participating workers? Or how are you going to design an end-to-end farm-to-fork solution where a lot of share of the value is actually going back to the farmers and not being expropriated by the platform that just controls this critical infrastructure of flows? Or for instance, in the case of social media, how do you design another media that's actually not like subordinate to surveillance capitalism, but is very pro-people? Or if you look at tourism sector, how can you have something that is sustainable and promoting ecotourism models instead of like a very status quoist Airbnb type of platform? And I will end my initial points here because friends from SEWA have been working a lot on looking at how to build alternative digital network, cloud infrastructure, platform models. And the path is not easy. And I think it will be great to hear their insights now.
Thank you so much for that, Nandini, for that incisive and critical introduction to issues around data capture and big tech. So we'll move then to Dhruv and Anupriya. So could you talk a bit about what Nandini mentioned towards the end as well? What are some of the practical on-ground approaches that you have been able to employ in your work with women's cooperatives and people's organizations to leverage the digital commons?
Thank you, Ambika. Firstly, I think maybe it would be good to introduce ourselves. I'm Dhruv. I work as a social enterprise associate at SEWA Cooperative Federation in Ahmedabad. We work on a number of areas and on capacity building, especially, where we are looking at the digital space as one of the potential ways in which we can build capacities within our organizations. Anu?
Hi everyone. My name is Anupriya S. I'm also like Dhruv, working as a social enterprise associate, focused on the digital initiatives bit itself. So we put together a presentation that will be running in the background. So Dhruv, over to you.
Thank you, Anu. Just to give some context for those who are not familiar with SEWA, SEWA is a movement of women in the informal sector, which was established in 1972 by Elaben Bhatt. We strive towards the formalization of our members' work through a two-pronged approach of struggle and development, struggle through unions and advocacy, and development through a capacities approach. We presently have about 17 lakh members, 17 lakh SEWA sisters across 18 states. And we also work very closely with their collective enterprises. So these social enterprises that we're talking about, they mainly interact with us through the enterprise support system, of which both Anu and I are part of. The main role of the enterprise support system is to build capacities within women in these collective enterprises in terms of management, finance, marketing, policy, and advocacy. We as of our last stock taking, there are about 150 collective social enterprises that operate independently within the SEWA network. We collect data and research in many ways as part of the ESS on these enterprises, and we guide them and mentor them through various stages of an enterprise's life cycle, from inception, stabilization, growth, transformation, and in some exceptional cases, even closure, if that is deemed necessary. Seeing our origin in the labor movement and in the union, on the union side of things, we have seen in the past few years, 10 years, that there has been an increasing move towards digital technology in the day-to-day lives of our members, be it Amazon affecting sales of street vendors or various new forms of business that Nandini had outlined in the digital space as well. We are hoping that we would be able to use some of these platforms, use some of these models, use some of these tools to help our members improve their economic and social power within this whole system. Unfortunately, a lot of our digital initiatives don't work in a vacuum, and there's a whole ecosystem that is required, and that's where we fit in. And that's why for a lot of grassroots level enterprises, they are unable to effectively participate in this. And I feel like that's where this conversation about digital commons comes in more so than most. We at the enterprise support system at SEWA would work with various enterprises on helping them access e-commerce platforms, build their own if necessary, get linked with digital payment infrastructure, or even just basically train people in basic digital literacy, be it using a phone camera or tools like Canva, which we have found in our day-to-day work in helping them extremely useful. Built off of the democratic principles that SEWA was built on, we believe that the ownership and the governance of all these enterprises and all these platforms are explicitly with the women members in the community, and how they choose to govern this is their choice. Women are collectively the users, they are the managers and the owners of these collective platforms and collective enterprises. Over the last few years, we have seen a change in the working conditions, and using that, I feel like, as an entryway into the digital initiatives, we would like to just, I feel like the COVID pandemic has really fast-tracked a lot of the work that was ongoing prior to it. So at one end of the spectrum, yes, there are a number of tools which are proprietary in nature, which we are using, but would come on the margins of what you could call digital commons, say a WhatsApp, a Zoom, or a Google Meet. We find that using these free to use tools mostly, we are able to engage a lot more participation from our members, be it at board meetings or at other institutions. So I'll give you the example of our insurance enterprise, Vimo Seva. It is a multi-location, multi-state enterprise, and we've had for many years trouble bringing together all our members as part of board meetings. Recently, this has actually been one area where we've seen massive growth, and we've seen increasing participation from board members, and therefore we're seeing much more engagement from the ground and the grassroots as well. We also don't want to think about these digital initiatives and digital commons without looking at some of the underlying issues of digital in India, which most of us would also have had some kind of engagement with through our experience. For example, we have a large number of households in India where the access to digital technology itself is mediated by a male member of the family and or the household, and we really need to think of beyond just the social beyond just the platform level analysis of this, we also need to look at the socioeconomic and cultural sides of this, so that we are able to allow this basic access to the commons to start off with. Secondly, the digital literacy is also a necessity, because quite often you may have access to the tools themselves, but knowledge of how they are used is a challenge, especially when they are in a foreign language like English. You quite often we find that our members are not they cannot read or write in these languages. So for them, having platforms in their native language could be one solution. But at the same time, knowing that a lot of these tools may not actually be translated, we also make sure that we train our members in this as best as we can. In an attempt to change the status quo on platforms, as well as Nandini had also mentioned, we have a number of digital initiatives that we're currently taking up. We use this to build our sisters' capacities in digital tools and also increase their access to some of this technology. And there are 4 of these that I think we'll be highlighting today specifically. I think Nandini's talk also covered some of the broad points that we would like to cover as well. One is the Farm to Table initiative that we're taking up in Ahmedabad. The second is the Ghar Par Seva personal and home care platform. The third is Seva Atiti, our ecotourism initiative. And the fourth is Seva Sarvekshan, which is our grassroots researcher program. So I think Anu will just give you a brief introduction about 2 of them right now.
Thanks, Dhruv. So like Seva, like Dhruv has already mentioned, Seva Sarvekshan is something that we'd like to begin with, and connecting largely to this idea of these conversations as well. So as a lot of people already know, Seva has been collecting and analyzing data for almost like more than 50 plus years in gender studies or in development studies, and still is continuing to contribute to do so. So especially right now during the pandemic and the COVID situation, one of the major things that we saw was data collection in a physical ambience with this pandemic going on, where there is a fear of you being a carrier or getting infected. This kind of also allowed us to increase more on the potential of grassroots researchers and developing a skill set for the same, which would also allow us to generate the data, but also provide a source of livelihood for the community in the tough times. So when we shared this idea with our members in Bihar for the first time, especially like Reenu Ben or Sangeeta Ben and Raju Bhai and Sandeep Bhai, they were already using a smartphone. So for them and with the COVID and them working in the informal sector has been a major strike for them as well. So seeing an opportunity for them to use their digital device to actually earn a source of income was very much appreciated by them. And they were excited to do the training sessions. And one of the important things that we noted here is that how we are able to connect them to do these training sessions. A trainer in Delhi is able to use a tool like Zoom to actually connect with them in Bihar. And we are actually developing that network, not only just in Bihar, but also in other parts like Gujarat, Uttarakhand, where geography is really tough and terrain is very different. And across the different nations also with the Sevas network that we have. So one of the things that we saw is that we're building the digital capacity with our own members to facilitate the data gathering, which lead to the research that is often for and by the community themselves, continuing to work on the social science research. This was something that we saw, and it was a new experience for them to also get to know the ethics of conducting researchers, surveys, speaking with other SEWA members across the different geographies, and getting to know how the impact of COVID has been. And so today, with around like 12-member team across Bihar, Gujarat, and Delhi, we have completely successfully completed 2 studies with a sample size ranging from over 200 to 2,000 that largely focuses on analyzing the impact of COVID in the informal sector. So here, the major thing that we see is that the tool that we use for data collection is a tool like Kobo Toolbox, which a lot of people will be familiar with, like unlike ODK, it's also is an open software tool. But with Kobo, one of the unique features that we saw is that likewise, it also allows you to collect data offline. And here it was multilingual. Connecting back to what Dhruv also said, like most of the time time, a lot of these applications that are open software not necessarily be by default in English and not necessarily be inclusive of a lot of geographies. Kobo had an advantage of that, that it offers a language ranging from like Malayalam, Hindi, Marathi, and to a lot more, which became more inclusive to our app. So our members using these apps for the first time, they can quickly go in and change the language setting, and they can continue to operate that app in their regional language, which became a major advantage for us to continue using this tool as well. And the user phase was also easy for them to navigate through. So even when we are conducting these training sessions, it becomes important that for a person who's coming from a background of not having a large digital literacy level is able to absorb these new tools and is able to continue to work with them. So right now we are kind of making tutorial videos for them with like easy annotations and such, and they're very much grasping it, which is also an impression that people have towards the informal sector, is that people coming from a different background and such may not be able to grasp this, but they're really excited and they do want to learn, and they do explore opportunities at which they can actually make that happen. So what happens is that having such access to such a tool makes them competitive and sustain their work in the larger competitive data collection industry itself. And one of the fundamentals of this pilot is to have such an open software tool for us to actually continue with this. And it has been a great way of creating them a livelihood opportunity and a source of income generation. And meanwhile, it would also become a learning curve for them to kind of get that exposure to see the impact of COVID across the different geographies and different trade, and see how that is also, that data collection itself is bringing back to the community, not in terms of a monetizing value, but the policies that are made around it. So this pilot is on a now, this is on a survey. SEWA Survection is still at a very pilot stage. We are developing that network. We have completely successfully completed 2 other contracts, and we are in the mode of completing more. There are more the network is being created, and there are more of second generation SEWA members. So basically, young girls who want to continue this and take it forward and explore this opportunity much more. So the other pilot that we had is around SEWA Atiti. SEWA Atiti, as like going back to Nandini, on like the tourism industry, because over the last few years, last few months, everybody knows that because of COVID, that tourism has been like one of the massively negatively impacted industries as such large. And one of the things that we saw is how people are coming up with the different mechanisms to cope up with it. So SEWA Atiti was actually started in 2019 itself, and it was to actually build alternative source of livelihood for our members in the hills. This is we are running the pilot in Uttarakhand, in districts of Almora and Rudraprayag. So it's an aim to promote community-based tourism responsible and sustainably as well, to give that authentic grassroots level rural lifestyle and exposure to that. We actually developed the couple of homestays and tour guide modules around this piece. So one of the things that we saw is the digital intervention here is to help the community achieve a market linkage. And given the COVID situation, the trainings and everything that was happening at the other sessions were happening online. So a lot of members coming from a rural background, they're not really used to actually do a lot of things on Zoom or in Hangouts or in WhatsApp. And so then the communication trying to do that and having the participation was like a very good improvement for us, because physically connecting with all the members was a challenge and is a challenge in a hilly area. So tools, which I said, we can't nearly draw that line. They are open to all, but at the same time, there are certain restrictions and limitations to these tools like WhatsApp and such. But one of the interesting things that I would like to say here is that during COVID, one of the recent over the last 2-3 months, one of the major trend has been on online experience. And as Nandini rightly said, Airbnb has been the trend maker of it as such itself. So one of the things that we found is that we had a difficulty in actually getting it registered there, because we are a grassroots level, community level initiative, and not necessarily be seen as the professional standards or such. So it became important for us to also test it out and see how we can actually do this together. So we had like young members who are Komal Ben and Hemlata Ben, You can see one of them during the training session snapshots also here. One of the another thing is that they are already part of this government initiative that we, SEWA Uttarakhand is also partnered with, is a Navniti project, which basically focuses on improving the digital literacy of the grassroots level women. They were also part of that program, and they were really interested in actually testing this out. And they were really warm and excited about the training sessions that we did. So they learned how to use the cameras and tools, and we actually did the training and also the virtual experience on Zoom itself. But now what here happened is that we have a group of people who have the digital skill set, and with a certain level of training, we are pretty much good to go, right? And we have a tool to conduct the virtual experience as well. But now the access to connectivity to this kind of a service, so to actually do this online experience, you need to have a good bandwidth. You need to have that good infrastructure to be able to connect it. So in Uttarakhand, being a geography where there is a limited physical infrastructure for a good internet connectivity, we were limited in providing a satisfactory online experience. So it becomes like a question of not only having the tool to do this kind of an initiative, or whether the tool is also accessible for us to do, but it also becomes important for us to actually have the physical infrastructure for us to able to work with that tool. And more or less, working in a case of informal sector, most of the people kind of need to also keep in mind is that when there is a most of the sector, people kind of tend to, the first thing that goes when a pandemic hits or when the income is in the threat is actually phones or data plans or recharge plans and around those things. So then kind of giving them a potential opportunity of how they can actually strive using this, it requires a lot of time and awareness, and a lot of policies around this also, because this is not an individual's hand or an organization, a single level organization, to change the fact of a limited physical infrastructure itself. So then it becomes like a shared responsibility where there are different shareholders coming in, because it's important to see, like, in a world of rapid digitization that's happening, and especially with the present pandemic ongoing, the opportunities that are limiting and also the opportunities that are aspiring, it is important for us to be able to grasp onto them. And that cannot be just done by within one person of a hand, but it is where a different community members come together, and hopefully, like what we have today, is also be able to pull us together. So I think that those are the two pilots that I wanted to place in contrast, to see how one where we have a good tool and where we are able to do certain things, and on the other hand, where we have a tool to do that, we have a skill set, we are training them, but due to the limited access of such and due to the lack of infrastructure to actually support these kind of initiatives, where we have been limited, we are not able to explore more. And we have the other two pilots. Dhruv, would you like to take them over? Sorry, did we lose Dhruv?
Dhruv, are you here?
Okay.
Should we come back to Dhruv? We can go to Nandini quickly, and once Dhruv is active again, we can come back.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for those examples, and those. It's very exciting to see these truly radical and participative platform models, as opposed to, the kind of examples that Nandini was talking about, and actually encouraging equity and redistribution rather than monopolization of data. So we'll move to you, Nandini, then, and so I think it's also critical to talk about the governance of these data commons. And so would you be able to tell us a bit more about what you think are the do's and don'ts about governing platforms and data commons, and some of the critical policy dilemmas, especially from an Indian and global South perspective?
Thanks, Ambika. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say that, yeah, while we wait for Dhruv to come back and share more about SEWA's initiatives, I will address this question. And I would like to start by answering one of the questions that was posed on the chat. that, right now in India, there are so many data collection initiatives and drives being planned. And in the context of the corona virus, we are also hearing about like this renewed push for building a national digital health and data ecosystem, right? And this, like, the government is in full swing. But firstly, this is highly problematic because we are doing all these initiatives to create like publicly provisioned data commons without a personal data protection bill. And this is a very big problem today because without a legislation on personal data protection, we absolutely have no protection about the kind of private and state-led data collection exercises that are going on. And I think that any discussion on dilemmas for governing the commons would still have to address this issue, that we don't have a PDP Act and the PDP bill is pending. And there are also a lot of lacunae within the personal data protection law itself, which we can't go into right now, but that's also important to flag. Having said that, we see that the government of India has started this new initiative called National Open Digital Ecosystems. And why am I speaking about that in the context of like a data commons or a digital commons discussion? It's because, like friends from SEWA were sharing, when we look at building digital commons, we have to understand that it is an exercise that is highly infrastructure and investment intensive. For instance, a lot of the time, we on the ground are forced to use freemium tools, like things like WhatsApp, Facebook, or Google, etc., where you may not be paying money to charge, but your data is getting collected, and you may not really have an option here at all, because to create your parallel, let's say Google or parallel Facebook or parallel WhatsApp or parallel ecosystem, the investments are not possible with anybody other than like the state, right? Because it's such an infrastructure investment intensive exercise. And so when we are finally looking at data commons that can be leveraged for public good, there is a role the state has to play in creating these cloud and data infrastructure on which like innovation can happen, and using these things in different sectors like education, health, urban governance, etc. And that is what the node project of the government is trying to do. So at the first level, this seems like a very good idea, but there's a very big problem here, that there are no rules of access about who will access this digital ecosystem and what will happen to the data and digital products that are built on top of it, which just means that the state ends up creating like a channel or a easy modality through which private IT companies, especially big tech companies, can expropriate these data resources from the public system and build their own like locked up tools. So for me, this is one of like the critical policy dilemmas, because whenever we talk about data commons, usually we will kind of mix up the data commons with all open access resources. And that's a problem, because in open access resources, there is a possibility of free ridership and value capture. And at the other instance, we probably think that data commons can only be provisioned by the state. And that also is a problem if the state is not bound by personal data protection and other legislation for non-personal data governance on how the value is getting shared, what kind of innovation is getting built on top of like data resources and all that. So this is one critical dilemma. The second thing I want to talk about is that right now, for instance, we have to recognize that valuable intelligence about most markets in a sector are monopolized by a handful of platform companies. For example, like colleagues from SEWA were sharing right now, it's extremely difficult to build an alternative tourism platform from the ground. Of course, it's very difficult in the context of COVID, but even assuming that there was no COVID and there was like full connectivity on the ground and the digital connection barriers were not there, it would still have been difficult to build such a platform, because already Airbnb and those platforms are miles ahead, because they have colonized data and digital intelligence, and there is a particular lead or advantage that they have. And to take another sector, for example, if we think of like, we know there are so many problems with Uber. That is one, let's say, platform company where we know everyone agrees there are problems with this model. Suppose we want a worker-owned driver cooperative where the platform and data are cooperatively owned by drivers and that platform infrastructure works in favor of drivers. If such a thing has to be launched, as unions in India have been highlighting, and they want access to a set of business data in the transport sector that Uber has currently monopolized, generating out of driver interactions on platforms. So it's the driver's behavioral data that is producing this intelligence, and Uber has colonized it, and it's difficult to get Uber to share that data. There is no framework currently to force this disclosure, right? Now, for example, even assuming that we are working within the personal data protection framework and this personal data protection bill goes through into law, drivers would maximum have a right to explanation, and they could get access to their personal data and demand an explanation about their profiles. But that's not the same thing as saying the collective data or valuable business analytics from driver interactions. Uber has to open this up so that other type of innovative models can be built, right? So how do we stake collective claim in the data that is generated from these member interactions in a community, right, of workers or of farmers or of critical economic actors? So we don't have really a narrative going on about platform or data cooperativism. And I come to my final point here. I want to say that in the European Union, if you look at the data strategy that was released in Feb 2020, there is a recognition that in the coming years, market failure cannot be fixed under a competition law framework for digital companies. And it's important to make access to data compulsory wherever you know that the market has failed because there is a monopoly happening, and under fair, transparent, reasonable, proportionate, and non-discriminatory conditions, the set of conditions that are popularly known as FRAND, it's important for businesses to be able to access this data so that innovation happens, and it doesn't happen that a few Googles and GAFAs of the world corner all the benefits. So addressing this mandatory data sharing type of legislation, that is also very important for us. And I make my final point here that national level steps become extremely difficult in a context where in international and regional trade agreements, the US and its allies are pushing for a set of rules which will allow unrestricted cross-border data flows to happen for business as usual to continue. And especially since it is the US companies that largely benefit from these digital services models built on top of free flows of data. And China, of course, has had a different strategy. But just a couple of weeks ago, it was clear that China is also trying to look at a US mode of strategy to extract data from other markets. So I would just stop here.
Thanks so much for that, Nandini. That was quite a breadth of issues you covered there in governing the digital economy, and just I think highlighted the fact that this is an extremely complex space, especially because of the transnational nature of the ownership and use of digital platforms. We'll come back to Dhruv quickly, and you can talk about the initiatives that you were going to talk about.
Right. Thank you, Ambika. I'm sorry, I just dropped off for a second, but so I think there are two initiatives primarily that I'm working on at SEWA in Ahmedabad. One is the Farm to Table initiative that we are developing, and the second is the Ghar Par Seva platform for personal and care services. So for the Farm to Table platform that we are developing currently is a WhatsApp-based platform connecting the produce that our farmers make with the market demand. We're bringing in a value chain approach to this with the goal of really shortening the time from the crop being harvested to reaching our customers' tables, and along the way maximizing the role that our members play at each step of this, so that we are able to keep as much of this data, keep as much of these tools within us. We are presently connecting our farmers in Kheda district, which is near Ahmedabad, and Deena Ben, who is one of our one of our sisters. She's been working and managing this, she works and manages our vegetable shop in Ahmedabad's Jamalpur APMC. She alone has been managing this platform using this. So there is a lot of scope with these digital tools, even something as simple as WhatsApp, to create such a lot of impact. The challenge here is again a lot of what Nandini has been pointing out, which is that there is no control over the data here. We aren't really able to leverage it to the fullest extent on one side. On the other end, this data is owned by a corporation like Facebook, and we aren't really sure about how we can proceed to access some of that data if necessary. So this initiative we've been running for a little over a year now in Ahmedabad. We have generated over 1 lakh rupees in revenue. And now that we have been able to figure out how this is feasible, we're in the process of developing our own platform. And one of the key reasons, again, one of the key ideas behind this also is that we can choose what data to collect and what data we don't want to collect. Quite often platforms are collecting any and all data and then without knowing or deciding what they want to use that data for. So in our sense, we are only collecting data that we know that we have use for. The second platform that I would also like to talk about is the Ghar Par Seva personal care platform. We find that quite often our domestic workers right now are struggling because they are being replaced a lot of the time uh, by various kinds of technological interventions. So recently, for example, there were great rises in the sales of cleaning robots like Roombas and dishwashers and things like that. So we are seeing, okay, in this possibility, there is a growing need for short time kind of gigs. So Diwali cleaning was one, perhaps. Other kinds of B2B arrangements, alternate contracting arrangements like AMCs for cleaning, for care of elderly, and childcare as well. So we're starting with these three: home care, childcare, and elder care space, and growing from there through our platform in Ahmedabad. Now we're also looking at other sevas to actually be part of this. And the ultimate goal is that apart from just generating some form of employment, we are also looking to make sure that this is good quality employment, that the incomes are good enough to support a livelihood, sustain a livelihood, that there is some kind of formalization of informal work, and that there is some social security, so that in cases like right now when we're going through a pandemic, they aren't just left in the lurk by these platforms, like has been done by a lot of platforms at this point. So the platform, and one thing that I would like to highlight specifically about this platform that we're developing, the Ghar Par Seva platform, is that unlike most platforms where they are trying to force upon a lot of the workers and people like our members, the fact that they need to use this platform on a smartphone and use it in English, we are making sure that we build it with with at least three languages to start off with: English, Hindi, and Gujarati, because we'll be in Ahmedabad. But going forward, we will grow it into other languages as well. Secondly, the point about smartphones, we have worked with a couple of platforms on a couple of pilots to understand the space somewhat, and we are working on integrating features that allow this platform to also be accessible to users who are not without access to a smartphone. So feature phones and things like your work requests will be sent via SMS and you respond to accept or decline those. So we are looking into expanding this a little further, and I think a lot of good research is happening both by IT for Change and Center for Internet, SEIS, and we also work. We're hoping that this research continues and we are able to take the learnings from a lot of this and share a lot of our learnings as well in this ecosystem, so that we are able to benefit the people who are usually left out by these technologies. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dhruv. I think I'll just quickly mention the fact that in across some 48 platforms that CIS had mapped as part of our study on domestic work in the platform economy. We had around 2 who were able to provide any form of social security, and that's the sort of landscape that we are looking at. So I think it's extremely critical work that SEWA is doing today. So we'll open the floor for questions. We already have some questions in the chat box, so I encourage everyone to post their questions into the chat box. So we'll start with Narendra's question. So Nandini or Deepthi, IT from whoever's from IT for Change, could take this perhaps. So our question is, where does India figure in digital initiatives, and how the government itself is dealing with people's personal data and its security with initiatives like the Aadhaar and Arogya Setu? Nandini or Deepthi, will you be taking this?
Deepthi, will you be taking this?
Maybe you can start off and then I'll add if that's okay.
Okay. So, yeah. So to answer the question about where the government's digital policy initiatives are at, okay, one of the fundamental problems is that it has been 25 years, but we have still not solved the very basic problem of the digital divide and digital inclusion. And for instance, just yesterday, you might have seen that there was a report which spoke about, for instance, in certain places in rural Odisha, digital penetration is as low as 6%. And this is a very big problem, and it's still very relevant. And I want to flag it here because over time, as an issue, access has lost its sheen, and we are starting to treat that issue like things have passed by, and there are more cooler things like data and AI to focus on. At least the policy direction seem to suggest that, but without like fixing the fundamental problem of public broadband and ensuring access for everybody, I think in digital policy, this is a priority that is missing. I also want to talk about the fact that the reality in many households is access to the internet through shared gadgets. And there is also a lot of family and social surveillance and gender-based related controls on access to the internet and snooping and things like this, right? So I would say that addressing cyber violence and looking at women's access in an equal sense, this needs to be a policy of like the government, and this is an area which has actually been neglected because we seem to do things like safe apps and smart cities and all those things, but we don't look at the very core and fundamental problems. I also want to point to another policy gap which was highlighted by Pradyumna in the chat, that when we look at building successful platform cooperatives, I completely agree with the comment in the chat box that this cannot come from, venture capital type of funding models where there is only cash burn and extractivism. And we need to think of other cooperative financing or publicly, type of financed accelerators and things like that. And this is an area where we have done very poorly. Like, for example, if we look at the national AI strategies and the pathways that are laid by the government, the whole assumption seems to be that there will be some kind of an open digital platform data ecosystem that the government will lay out. And let's say the private players will come and build on top of that, and benefits will trickle down to everyone. This seems to be the implicit script, and that's really not working in our digital policy. And of course, the most important question, that we are digitizing our service delivery systems, and we all know what has happened to Aadhaar and the exclusions that went. So the whole idea that there has to be a rights and let's say citizenship based focus when we look at digitalizing governance systems or even creating enabling innovation, and it's not just about a narrative of becoming a digital superpower. This for me is the biggest deficit in the current digital policy directions in India. Having said all this, I would also like to acknowledge that there is one line though that, let's say trade negotiators from India have managed to successfully hold at the WTO and in plurilateral trade negotiations. The fact that, the US push for free cross-border data flows that just benefits US companies, they have been like challenging that narrative. And after having said all these negative dimensions, I also want to highlight that this is one area where the policy pushback seems to be right on the international stage. Thank you.
Deepthi, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I think good evening, everyone, and happy to be part of this session today. I think Nandini made a lot of, important points, and I think I just want to add to that to suggest that she's absolutely right in saying I think there is an ardent desire for techno-solutionism, which we've seen a lot of in the past few years, more so in the post-COVID context. And that's not atypical in India. It's really a global problem in that sense. But I think that techno-solutionism doesn't somewhere really come back to the question of rights. It doesn't come back to fully address the question of access. For example, there was a very ambitious project a few years ago. It was called BharatNet, and we don't really know what the status of that anymore is. But there was this idea that we need to have strong fiber-based connectivity, that is internet connectivity, to all the panchayats in the country. And somewhere down the line, that scheme got wrapped up into this very nebulous idea of digital India, which you can ask a lot of experts. They still won't be really able to tell you what exactly digital India is. It's the beauty of the term. It can hold everything and nothing at the same time. So these very fundamental questions of access still remain. And I think that's a very important and critical deficit between the desire. Having said that, I also agree with Nandini's point that if anybody could do it, I think in the global south, in terms of having a vision for the digital, having the ability, the talent in-house, and also the policy sort of strength to really develop digital commons visions, etc., it could be India, because of the important role it has played in the global trade arena with regards to e-commerce, and also with regards to being one of the very few countries, honestly, to actually show and model public goods like the unified payments interface. Many problems with it. I'm not going to launch into a defense and say it's the most brilliant product of all times, but the fact that there was a recognition a few years ago that what, if we don't actually get our payment system right, this whole e-commerce tide is going to become a nightmare for cybersecurity. It's going to become a nightmare for fraudulent activity. It's going to become like this extremely big issue that will just upset the entire market system. I think that recognition led to this whole idea of a system like the unified payments interface coming in, which is very wildly successful. It has issues. It does there are still questions about where the data is going, and those are the important points that Nandini is pointing to, that which she said earlier as well, right? That unless we fix the personal data question and we begin to fix the non-personal data question, I think all of these systems remain imperfect. So I think that's the only two things that I wanted to add to this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Deepthi. I'll move to Anu and Dhruv. So there's a question from Joseph about the accuracy of data. So how you could perhaps talk about the data collection tools that you were using in your pilot. How are you able to use them to generate accurate, authentic data? And there's another question. So the question from Pradyumna, I think you could perhaps speak to that as well, about building sustainable platforms in a context where cooperatives may not be able to get the kind of capital that sort of for-profit organizations are able to get access to.
Sure. I'll take the first one. The second one, I think Dhruv can better answer that. Well, responding to the first question is that I think there is a certain set of, even with physical data collection also, that there are certain level of accuracy that comes in. One thing that I would like to point out is that normally if you look at the informal sector itself, as I said in the early itself, then normally when a pandemic or any threat to an income generation hits, the first thing to go is basically a phone or basically like the data plan or the SIM plan itself. So then when we are doing a data collection in the informal sector, it becomes important the respondents list, the accuracy and the sample size itself. SEWA to have had that network and an established kind of over the 50 years with that community relationships that we have, we're still able to get that data. But that said, there are still challenges with us also when we're working with, it may not be possible that a member is able to retain the same number. So then even with inbound like to have the larger like having these data collections done. And for example, the learning hub, we under Seva Bharat, we have another vertical who's the research wing of learning hub itself. It's called the learning hub, which is led by Dr. Paramita Sen. So we do have internal requirements for data analysis to study about how our members are actually coping up with the mechanism that that depend, and that shapes our policy interventions and also our personal interventions within the Seva community itself. Given that one of our important observation that we saw, especially during the pandemic, is how the respondents list or the rate at which survey is done, the number of times. For example, if you're taking a collection of 10 lists of informal sector members working in, be it domestic, farmers or construction workers, be it any trade, you take around like 10 to 15 lists, and out of that, you may be able to only reach 5 or less than that. That is the current rate, and it is important to acknowledge that fact in order to be able to do this research and able to understand the accuracy in it as well. And of course, there are certain set of like the verification of data and also triangulating the questionnaire to be able to get the maximum out of accuracy out of it. But one of the important, I think one of the advantage that we had is also that we being a grassroots level community network, we know the rhythm and the vibe of that particular respondent that we're speaking with. And when we are engaging with it, it will be when we were kind of interacting with them, we have like most of the women do not have phones, and when we end up calling them, we have our Agivans, who are basically the women who come up, the first field mobilizers, and that's the structure, and they are basically the fundamental roots of Seva itself, and we use them to kind of get our respondents list. So imagine when we're collecting this list, we at a team are trying to contact them, it's most likely that the person who we speak with, for example, when we're trying to connect with Reenu Ben, we will not be able to kind of connect with Reenu Ben herself. Maybe it's a husband or it's a son that we are actually getting connected with. So it's also important to kind of like understand this. And also what Nandini and Dhruv has also said during the beginning of this program itself is that access to digital tools and accepting or acknowledging that there is a gender gap. So there is a lot of factors that contributes towards having an accurate data and actually conducting a research. So you may have to account to these parameters and plan it accordingly. Then, yeah, as said, a grassroots level, being a grassroots team, you are able to kind of do that in a much more better planned way because you know the difficulties of the field, and thereby you kind of challenge and mend your team accordingly. I think that's more of the answer to the first question. I think Dhruv can answer to the next question.
Thank you, Anu. Yeah, I think when we're looking at platform cooperatives, I think that's a really interesting frame in which to look at how we're going forward and more equitable ways of going forward. The challenge here is that quite a lot of the time, establishing that, as Pradyumna mentioned, is a major financial challenge more than anything else. That we don't have the kind of capital available with us to actually burn so that we can get customers on board, so that we can get market share in the VC lingo. We need to build incrementally, and I feel like that is one strategy that we have to use. And the thing about a lot of VC backed platforms is that yes, they have a lot of capital to burn, but the challenge for them is that they have to also be profitable at some point. Our challenge here is that we are in a process where we have to build from some degree of profitability or break even and then go up from there. We could start off. So, for example, we started off the Farm to Table initiative as a WhatsApp-based platform. We have started other initiatives also using proprietary technology to start off with, and the free versions usually of these platforms, and then slowly, incrementally improving it. So there are many incremental techniques that I feel we can use and take it forward in a new way. So going forward, I think the ways in which we can access capital and uh, grow, scale our enterprises again is not necessarily to look at it in the traditional kind of VC-backed sense, but rather to look at it more as, okay, how many other people, how many other players can we cooperatively bring on board for this? Can we bring in, say we started with Ahmedabad today. There's another SEWA chapter in Chandigarh tomorrow, who could also potentially use the same platform. So we can share the same platform in that regard, make some tweaks here and there, and go about our work for the rest of it. So we have to use a lot of these ways to go around what seems to be the established norm, but there is a lot more. Meaning there are various strategies that can be employed, and we are also employing on the ground.
Deepti, would you like to come in here as well? And Nandini, I understand that you have to leave now. So thanks so much for participating and for the insights that you've shared. Yeah, it was a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you everyone once again. It was like fascinating to be part of this discussion.
Yeah, Deepti, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think the question is very important, and I just, I just wanted to add to, I think, the points colleagues from SEWA were making, that, if you look at the VC model itself, it's not like it's particularly profitable. I mean, it's profitable for the VCs, of course, but nothing about any of the digital economy trends that we've seen over the past decade has been profitable. Amazon has probably not even broken even yet on its e-commerce operations. It does very well on its cloud-based services, but it's yet to even like register proper full profits on its e-commerce, and it's the largest store in the world. Same goes for Uber, same goes for Swiggy, same goes for Facebook has struggled to make a profit for a long time. It's only now starting to do that. Google was broke for 15 years. It's only starting to make profits right now. So I think um, I wouldn't necessarily, and I think there is a shift that's happening definitely where, because of certain debacles that happened in 2019, which has been widely also referred to as the year of the tech lash, whatever that means, that, this model doesn't really work. We're burning money after money after money, and both Uber, very big company, WeWork, very big company, doesn't have so much of a presence in India, but it's still quite, you can see it all around Bangalore. Certainly its buildings are all there. Both of them had these spectacular flop shows at the IPOs, and there was this whole reckoning, a lot of discussion to the fact that, is this the way we're going to build our digital super players? And there has been some reckoning that, there is a need for businesses to actually be sustainable, to actually be profitable somewhere down the line. So that change is happening. I don't have a lot of hopes for that really to pan out, because ultimately, that there isn't, the financialization of the economy, of the digital economy in particular, plays its own game. And but I think for cooperatives, this is certainly a good thing, because there's finally an acknowledgement that we need emphasis on sustainability, and we need emphasis on viability, which can be limited profits, which can be high profits, which can be medium profits, etc. So I think that model is definitely shifting somewhere. There's some kind of a reckoning about it, and I wouldn't really lose hope, because we do see those things, we see a lot of money being spent on very large platforms, and ultimately they haven't really been profitable. So that question seems a bit like strange to me, just to kind of put that out there and then add to that perspective.
We have a question from Bhargavi. Are there other similar civil society groups who are working with farmers, and do donor organizations fund these initiatives, in particular, given their own agenda-driven funding? Would Dhruv or Anu, would you like to take this?
I think so there is a growing trend amongst a lot of social enterprises in this space, especially with platform cooperatives. I feel uh, for to develop similar models that work for the workers themselves, so that the people who are actually generating the value are growing. If I'm not mistaken, I think Bangalore itself is actually becoming a big hub for a lot of these enterprises. And the again the challenge here, I think, again, is what Bhargavi has also pointed to from a question, is that there seems to be a challenge with funding. Specifically, there's only a limited pot of funding available for these kinds of enterprises. And if we are to actually go beyond this and take this forward, uh, then we would be able to create a much larger impact. So I feel like, yes, there is a lot going on. Again, the scale of it may not be large and visible at present, but cooperatively, I feel like if you look at a lot of these and put them together across geographies, you would see a larger picture starting to emerge.
We also have Nitya, who's joined us from SEWA. Nitya, would you like to comment here as well? Oh, sorry, I will unmute you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a part of a great discussion. So I came midway, but I'm the coordinator for social enterprises work at SEWA Bharat. And just to take this question, I think more than agenda-driven funding, it's more about everyone wants to join on the digital bandwagon, and without really understanding what it has to offer right now. So we routinely hear from people, we want to do something digital in our project, something digital, but there's no understanding really about what is the digital element, what are the consequences of just starting something, what is, again, like, the amount of capacity building or just digital access work that you have to do before you get into the work of digital. So I think for us, the problem really lies at that end, that how do you, all funding preferences are just towards digital without understanding the opportunity and without investing money in digital access. So I think that's where it should, and then there's a lot of focus on build a platform without understanding, again, what the platform has to offer, whether that's what is needed by the members of a particular community or not. So that's from SEWA's experience.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the issues around techno-solutionism that we've been critiquing with policy are also the same ones that we set this space with donor organizations as well. We have another question from Purnendu about what about relationships and institutions that are not grounded in commodity value. I'm interested in relationships that are essentially useful but not commercial in nature. Are digital platforms constrained to where some market connect is necessary? SEWA, would you guys want to take this?
I can go.
Sure, yeah, go ahead, Diti.
Yeah, I think that's a very important, a very important question. And I think we should not forget, this is something I just, if you look at the history of platforms in the world, it's something that came up about right after the 2008 financial crisis, where there was this whole sort of reckoning in the Western world that, there's been an excess of capitalism and we need to go back to, these ideas of collaborative consumption, that we need to try and work on peer-to-peer networking. We need to have models where we're able to leverage our networks in our communities. And it is that sort of impetus that really gave rise to the early platforms, which then of course ended up becoming the Facebooks and the, the others that we know today. So I think the original promise of platform has always been about that. It's really been about trying to leverage connections, trying to renew ties and try to sort of establish relationships that don't necessarily function in a market framework. And we know of a lot of examples like that, which are currently happening in Europe and North America for certain. There's a lot of goods sharing platforms, for example, which try to reduce consumption by like having, do you have a pair of hiking boots that I could use instead of going to the store and buying one? That's just one small example. There's a global community of like bicyclists who've been on the internet for 15 years now, who've been sort of like, it's called warm showers. And it's a very interesting concept where essentially all they do is when they're out hiking or biking or anything, they connect with somebody who could offer them restroom facilities or like, just a place to stay for the night, etc. And it's something that works relatively to community level, but it's got like over like 19,000 people all around the world working on that. So definitely, I think those opportunities do exist. In the global south, not so much yet, but I think that's just because the challenges to building a successful or even a viable platform to begin with, that, even with the for-profit principle is so difficult. I think these experiments have still been somewhat on the low down, but they do exist.
We have a follow-up question from Bhargavi for SEWA, I think, and she's asking if you've tried working with governments to scale your platforms. I see Dhruv is, and both Nitya and Dhruv have some thoughts on this.
Go ahead, Nitya.
Yeah, okay. So I think at this point, we are very focused on working with the platforms that the government itself has to offer on what can be done over there. So for example, government e-marketplace is a good example of a e-commerce platform that was launched. There are a lot of hiccups. It's a very interesting opportunity. And our way has been engaging with them to, from the very beginning, when GEM was launched, they had a focus of women enterprises having a 3% reservation for women enterprises to sell over there. And I think since then, we've been giving them continuous feedback on how is it that the idea of a platform can increase. Or how the platform can become a better experience for women enterprises. I would say it's a slow process. In terms of other digital platforms, I think what I see is very recently Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship has started coming in the whole non-traditional livelihoods approach. And what I see again and again is they're all looking for innovation and some digital element in the call for proposals that come out. So, so far in terms of working with governments on digital platforms, our experience has mostly been with this e-commerce lens and not a platform for governance yet.
Dhruv, do you have anything to add here? Okay. So Nupur, we'll come back to your question, but I'll take Karthik's first. So he's asking about the concept of treating one's digital footprint as a digital asset, as a form of virtual property. So if this would allow platforms to pay or compensate for using one's data, and would it also push for data privacy from an individual perspective and contribute to strengthening open data platform spaces? Deepti, would you want to take this question? Deepti, you're on mute.
Thank you. Data monetization, as in personal data monetization, has been one of those new and emerging ideas that certainly there's a lot of work being done in, and I cannot claim to be an expert, but I think essentially it comes down to how do you really initiate that process. It's not a total no in my opinion, and it's certainly something that a lot of organizations are trying to really model policies around. But where do we sort of like when it comes to data monetization, how do we really draw the lines around how are data subjects really choosing to make that trade-off, right? Is that really a choice for me? Is that like a meaningful choice for me to say that I'm happy to give you access to all my social media feeds to, let's say, credit insurer A or B or C, so that you can profile me and like, create these ideas of who I am and slot me as a borrower or a lender or so have you. I think we don't really know very much yet about like, how do those choices really function when people are making trade-offs of that kind. It's certainly an area that is being explored, I know, but I think for that to happen, I think two things really need to happen. One, we need strong personal data protection frameworks, and we need something which is at a global level as well. We need like a data constitutionalism which really lays down, like we have a human rights framework, right, that's global and everybody understands, you cannot enslave people, you cannot traffic people, there are rules and understood conventions around that. I think it's time that we started working towards like, if we were to allow data monetization, what are the absolute no-goes, right? What are the ways in which we cannot allow people to, dehumanize themselves by engaging in certain kinds of data monetization? I mean, that the discourse is still sort of evolving. And like I said, I'm not an expert, but this is where I think, those two things, having those PDP protection systems well thought out and having some kind of like safeguards and bottom lines is absolutely vital for that process to even start, in my view.
Deepthi, perhaps you could take this one as well. A question from Nupur on the space for whistleblowers in the global south or in the Indian landscape. She says slightly off topic, but would you want to take this?
I didn't get the question, sorry. Could you just sort of...
how much space do you think there is for whistleblowers of the Julian Assange nature in the Indian landscape?
Not very much from, everything that we've been seeing in the past few, I think, years. I'm not really, my area of expertise is not really in this domain. I don't really look at the sort of the freedom of speech and those kinds of things are not really in my wheelhouse. I'm sorry, I wish I had a better answer, but it's not something I really directly engage with, so pass, I guess.
No, I definitely agree with your short answer as well. I don't think there is much space. I also had a follow-up question on to Karthik's question about personal data. So while we're on the topic, I think we could also talk a bit about the concept of community data and the non-personal data governance framework that the Ministry of Information and Technology is just floated for comments this past month. Deepthi, would you want to talk a bit about that? What are the policy issues that it's trying to govern? Maybe just a quick primer on some of the issues there.
Yes, very quickly, because I think that's a pretty like separate and large discussion in itself. But I think, I mean, it comes down to this, and this connects back to some of the issues that Nandini spoke about earlier, right? That what has happened, I think, since because of GDPR and because of Cambridge Analytica and because of certain watershed moments that have happened in, let's say, 2012 to 2014, etc., we've had a lot of discussions about personal data protection, which is very important, very necessary. But what this skewed, I would say, in my view, skewed policy focus in this area has done is it's left a lot of what we understand as non-personal data out for the taking. And that's essentially the problem, right? The absence of governance frameworks around this. And just to kind of clarify what I mean when I say non-personal data, we're talking about data that's not really attributable to any one data subject, any one person. So something about me, like my age, is probably my personal data, but like the fact that I was along with 100 other people somewhere else is like, something that may not directly tie back to me and which could be like understood as what we call non-personal data. And it's in fact this, because of the proliferation of IoT devices, because of the proliferation of sort of smartphone-based apps, etc., we've seen like a explosion of non-personal data in the past 5 to 6 years, especially with the rise of these very large corporations and platforms and high platform usage. That this is the data that really is at the heart of what's fueling the rise of, I think, large monopolies. So without accounting for the issue that there is this non-personal data, which, if we hark back to the language of primitive accumulation, somebody got there first and enclosed it, and now it's enclosed, and we really can't do very much about it because there's no governance framework around that. So I think that's sort of one of the key issues that, non-personal data brings up. And one thing that we've been working at IT for Change towards a corrective in that sense is to really articulate the concept of community data, right? The idea that the people who produce the data, the people from whom the data is generated, do have a stake in the process, do have a stake in the data, do have a right to it, whether they're farmer producer groups, whether they're drivers working for a platform, whether they're logistics workers who are like serving port systems or warehouse systems, etc., whether there are these large workforces who are servicing domestic work platforms such as urban company, etc. There is this idea that people who are generating this data do have a right over it, and only when we establish that a community of interest, which could be something like this, it could also be something at the level of the nation state, for example, that we can't understand the community as a nation state, that we're able to exercise some kind of sovereignty over it, exercise some kind of stake over it, and use it for public, maximizing community good, maximizing public good, maximizing social good, as we could see. So community data, in our view, is a stepping stone to the digital commons. The idea that, if you can claim something as your own and exercise direct ownership on it, of course, completely respecting personal data protection, respecting, the necessary safeguards that any such exercise would need, you're then able to actually correct this problem, right? The lack of data that startups are struggling with, that cooperatives like SEWA are struggling with, the civil society is struggling with, and the fact that there is so much opaqueness around this issue. To some level, that does get corrected through looking at this, and that's the framework that we're sort of forwarding. So I'll probably stop here because I think we're at 6:30, and I want to make sure that I don't hog extra time. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks so much, Deepthi. So unless we have any closing thoughts, would anyone from SEWA, would you have any closing thoughts? And or since we're already at the 6:30 mark, we can just stop here. Okay, so we'll stop there then. Thanks so much. Thank you to the participants who've stuck around for the full hour and a half. Thank you also to the people on Facebook, and again to CFA and ESG for organizing this.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambika, for that excellent moderation, and thank you to all our speakers, Nandini, Deepthi, Dhruv, and Anupriya, for sharing your experience and sharing your project and giving us an idea of what is happening and how technology has actually been explored to help farmers and people in the rural area who otherwise would not have had access to technology and the benefits of it. Do follow us on this series. To all our participants, we continue next week on the topic of maternal health of migrant laborers. And before I close, thanks to everyone in CFA, the Executive Director, Joe Athiali, and Leo Saldana of ESG, and my colleagues who've been in the ground and tweeting and taking care of Facebook and all the technology, Karthik, Sana, Ashwin, Ashish, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much.